Harlan came back after months away. The road felt different, wider, freshly paved, but nothing could prepare him for what waited at the end. Where his small home once stood, a massive hotel towered over the lake. Fresh banners flapped in the wind, promising luxury living. The place that had been his sanctuary was gone. The old pine tree, the one his wife had loved, had been cut down. In its place, raw concrete spread cold and lifeless. Beneath that slab of stone and steel lay his wife's ashes, the final promise he had sworn to protect. And then came the notice. A bright slip of paper stamped bold with authority. The HOA claimed he was trespassing on his own land. Linda, the president, even smiled as she handed it over. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. If you believe no homeowner should ever be bullied by an HOA, hit follow because you're about to watch their empire fall. Harlan drove the same truck he had owned for years, its paint faded and the engine groaning with every mile. To anyone watching, he was just an old man returning to a quiet lake after too long away. Neighbors saw him as little more than a widower clinging to the past. He kept to himself, never made trouble, and spoke little. To them, he was harmless, invisible, the kind of man who could be ignored without consequence. But to Harlan, the land was never just dirt and trees. Every corner carried a memory. He remembered the pine tree that once stood tall by the water, the place where he and his wife would sit together and watch the sun set. She loved how the light fell across the lake, painting the water in gold. That tree had been their marker, their promise. Now it was gone. He thought of the years he had spent caring for this land, cutting fallen branches after storms, repairing fences in the heat of summer, walking the boundary lines to make sure nothing had been disturbed. The place was never abandoned, never forgotten. He had poured too much of his life into it. The HOA believed he was just a frail old man who wouldn't fight back. They mistook his silence for weakness, but silence was simply the way he carried his grief. It was how he held on to his wife's memory without breaking. To the world, Harlan looked ordinary. A man past his prime, isolated with little left to protect. But those who judged him had no idea who he really was or what he was capable of when pushed too far. Have you ever seen someone dismissed just because they stayed quiet? The land had been in Harlan's family for generations. His grandfather had cleared the first paths through the woods. His father had built the split-rail fence that once marked the boundary lines. Every post, every stone carried the weight of history. To Harlan, it was never just property. It was heritage. The pine tree by the water had been the heart of it. Towering above the shoreline, it was where he and his wife chose to place her ashes. A simple stone had marked the spot, nothing grand, just something the two of them had made together. She wanted to rest where she could always see the sunrise over the lake. That tree had been her place, and it became his promise to protect it. For years he kept that promise. Through storms and winters he tended the land. He walked the trails, cut back brush, and repaired what time tried to take away. It was his way of keeping her close. The land was alive with memory, and memory was all he had left. Now it was gone. The tree had been cut down, the stone marker erased. The soil where his wife's ashes had been placed was torn open, buried beneath the foundation of someone else's dream. Where heritage had stood, banners now announced luxury rentals, now leasing. The HOA saw only profit. To them, it was empty ground waiting to be built over. They had no sense of the years layered into the earth, no understanding of what had been lost when the concrete was poured. They called it progress. To Harlan, it was desecration. The land was not abandoned, and it was not for sale. It carried the weight of his past, his love, and his promise. And though the signs around it now bore the HOA's name, he knew in his heart that it would always belong to him. To everyone around him, Harlan looked like an aging widower, with nothing left but fading memories. That was exactly how he wanted it to look. What they didn't know was that Harlan was not just an ordinary man. For decades, he had built one of the most successful real estate companies in the region. His name carried weight in boardrooms and city halls, though almost no one in this small community would have recognized it. He had signed off on developments larger than anything the HOA could ever imagine, and he had negotiated deals that shaped entire neighborhoods. But he never spoke of it here. He left his title behind whenever he came back to the lake. Harlan had always believed in seeing the world without filters. Long before his wife passed, he often chose to work quietly, slipping into projects without anyone knowing who he really was. He wanted to see people as they were, not as they acted, when they realized a man of power was in the room. In his industry, they called it undercover work. To him, it was the only way to know the truth. He never flaunted his success. The old truck, the modest cabin, the quiet life, it wasn't an act. It was who he preferred to be. But behind the silence stood a man with resources far greater than anyone suspected. When Linda and the HOA laughed at him when they handed him a trespassing notice on his own land, they thought they were humiliating a powerless old man. They had no idea the man they mocked could walk into a bank and find their loan file sitting on his desk. They had no idea the man they dismissed as forgotten had the knowledge and means to undo every paper they had filed. They didn't know that Harlan was an undercover boss, one who had spent a lifetime learning exactly how greed destroyed itself. For now, he let them believe the illusion. He let them treat him as weak, invisible, irrelevant. Every insult, every false document, every smirk only added fuel to what he was about to do. His silence was not surrender. It was patience. And when the time came, his patience would become their undoing. Do you think they would still dare to laugh if they knew who he really was? Harlan stepped out of his truck and walked toward the half-built structure. The sound of drills and hammers filled the air, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the place where the pine tree used to stand, now swallowed by concrete and scaffolding. Two men in hard hats unloaded drywall from the back of a truck. Harlan raised his voice enough to be heard. "You need to stop. This is private property. This land is mine." The workers exchanged a glance. One of them, a man in his 40s with tired eyes, wiped sweat from his brow. "Sir, this isn't your property anymore." HOA signed it over. They told us it was abandoned. Abandoned. The word hit him like a stone. "This land was never abandoned," Harlan said, his voice steady. "My family has lived here for generations. I was here before any HOA ever existed." The younger worker shrugged, shifting the weight of the boards on his shoulder. "Look, we just follow orders. HOA runs the show now. If they say it belongs to them, that's enough for us." Harlan felt his jaw tighten. "Do you know what you've built over? Do you know what you destroyed?" His hand pointed toward the ground where his wife's ashes rested beneath the foundation. "This is sacred to me. You can't just erase it with concrete." The older man avoided his eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't make the rules. HOA gave us permits, paperwork, everything. If you've got a problem, take it up with them. But we can't stop." Around them, other workers had started to notice. A few slowed their steps, watching with wary eyes. Harlan realized what he looked like to them, an old man clinging to memories, standing in the way of progress. To them, he wasn't an owner. He was just an obstacle. "Please," Harlan said, his voice low but firm. "This is my land. You're trespassing." The younger worker shook his head. "No, sir. That's what they said about you." The words cut deeper than any insult. In a single sentence, Harlan had been transformed from rightful owner into a stranger on his own soil. The hotel rising behind them wasn't just a building. It was proof of how easily lies could become reality when no one bothered to question them. The men went back to their work. Boards were carried through door frames, nails hammered into beams, and Harlan stood alone in the middle of it, all treated as though he had no right to be there. They thought he was just a nuisance. They thought he would give up. But in their dismissal, they had made their first mistake. Harlan left the construction site and drove straight to the house at the corner lot. He knew who he would find there. Linda Marks, the HOA president. Her name was on every notice, every letter, every false claim. She opened the door before he could knock, as if she had been waiting. Her smile was practiced, the kind that belonged to real estate agents and salespeople, polished until it gleamed. She held a mug of coffee in her hand as if she had all the time in the world. Well, she said, her tone sweet but sharp underneath. Look who finally came back. Welcome to the new and improved preserve. Harlan forced his hands to stay at his sides. There's a hotel being built on my property. You need to stop it. Linda sipped her coffee slowly, watching him over the rim. Your property, she echoed, tilting her head as though explaining something simple to a child. We sent you notices, certified letters, rezoning updates. You never answered. When land is abandoned, it can't just sit there forever. The board had to move forward. Abandoned. The word carried more anger than he intended. I left for a few months. My family has owned that land for over 60 years. There's nothing abandoned about it. She gave a small laugh, shaking her head. That's not what the records say. According to the county, you neglected it. According to us, it's now part of the preserve community. You should have been more responsible. The condescension in her voice was worse than the words themselves. She spoke as if she were the authority, and he a stubborn old man clinging to something he no longer owned. You can't erase boundaries with paperwork, Harlan said. That land was never yours to take. Linda leaned against the doorframe, clearly enjoying herself. You really should have answered your mail. These things have a process. You missed your chance, and now it's done. The hotel will be finished soon, and there's nothing you can do about it. Her smile widened, cold and victorious. To her, the conversation was already over. She had the papers, the board, the county clerk, even the sheriff on her side. And what did he have to her eyes? Only age and grief. Don't waste your breath fighting something you've already lost, she added, her tone almost pitying. Enjoy what's left of your retirement somewhere else. Harlan studied her carefully. The smug tilt of her chin, the absolute confidence in her own story, the way she didn't even consider the possibility that she might be wrong. She thought she had tied everything up neatly. He didn't argue further. There was nothing more to gain from words. She believed she had won. That was her mistake. Without another response, Harlan turned back to his truck. Linda's voice followed him, light and mocking. Have a nice day, Mr. Jensen. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. Let her laugh, now, he thought. The smile on her face wouldn't last forever. The next morning, a county sheriff's SUV rolled slowly down Harlan's driveway and stopped behind his truck. The sound of the engine idling broke the quiet of the lake. A young deputy stepped out, his posture deliberate, one hand resting near his belt. He scanned the property before walking toward the porch where Harlan stood waiting. Mr. Jensen, the deputy asked. Yes. The deputy unfolded a piece of paper, the county seal faint but visible in the corner. We've received a complaint from the Preserve Homeowners Association. They're claiming you're trespassing on community property and interfering with construction. Harlan let out a slow breath. This is my land. My family has owned it for generations. My deed is inside this house. The deputy avoided his eyes, glancing instead at the paper in his hand. According to the most recent filings, this parcel is now listed as part of the Preserve Commons Phase 1. The building permit doesn't have your name on it anymore. It's registered under a development LLC. Harlan reached for the document. The deputy handed it over without protest. It was a cheap photocopy of a county map. His name, once printed clearly, had been replaced. A dotted line cut through the property, folding his land into the HOA's jurisdiction, as if it had always belonged to them. His throat tightened. This is fraud, he said. I'm not here to argue deeds, sir, the deputy replied carefully. I'm just telling you what the county has on record. The HOA president has requested that you vacate until the matter is resolved in court. If I have to come back, I'll have to issue a citation. The words fell like stones. Vacate. Trespassing. Citation. Each one chipped away at the truth of who he was and what this land meant. Behind the deputy, a construction truck rumbled down the road toward the site as if to underline the point. The world was moving on without him. Harlan forced himself to stand straight even as anger coiled in his chest. You're telling me I'm a trespasser in my own home." The deputy's expression flickered just for a moment with unease. "I'm telling you what the records say. You'll have your chance to challenge it in court. But for now, that's how it stands." He tipped his hat politely, turned, and walked back to his SUV. Moments later, the vehicle disappeared down the road, leaving only dust and silence in its wake. Harlan looked at the paper again. His name erased his property absorbed by a lie. He stood on ground that belonged to him, but in the eyes of the law, he no longer existed here. It was more than theft. It was erasure, and it left him standing on his porch with nothing but a worthless piece of paper and the weight of humiliation. But as the anger settled into something colder, steadier, he knew one thing he would not leave. Later that afternoon, the first message appeared in his inbox. It had been forwarded by someone he didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Community Update. Preserve Project." The email was signed by Linda herself. It painted Harlan as an absentee owner who had abandoned his land years ago, leaving it to rot. It claimed the HOA had stepped in to revitalize the area for the good of all residents and accused Harlan of showing up out of nowhere to disrupt progress. She called him selfish. She called him unstable. She framed him as a man clinging to a past that no longer mattered. The words were precise, polished, dripping with authority. And now the community believed them. That evening, Harlan stood by his window and watched as a car slowed at the edge of his drive. The driver stared for a moment too long before moving on. Another vehicle came, then another. Each one passed slowly, eyes lingering on his house as if he were some spectacle. Neighbors who had once waved now looked away. A few shook their heads. The silence between them carried judgment heavier than words. Two men walked past the property line the next morning. Harlan heard one of them mutter loud enough to carry, "Why doesn't he just move on? He's holding everyone back." The other laughed. "Old man doesn't even own the place anymore. He's just bitter." The words stung more than he expected. These were people who had lived beside him for years, people who had seen him care for the land, fix fences, clear roads after storms. And yet, with one email, Linda had turned him into an outsider. By the end of the week, the division was clear. Some neighbors fully embraced Linda's story, eager for the rise in property values the hotel promised. They saw Harlan as the obstacle standing in the way of their investment. Others stayed quiet, unsure what to believe, but their silence felt like betrayal all the same. Harlan felt the weight of isolation pressing in. On his porch, in the grocery store, even in church, the shift was there. Where once there had been nods and greetings, now there were cautious glances, whispers, and distance. He had not just lost his land on paper. He was losing his place in the community. But beneath the sting of rejection, something else began to take shape. The more they turned their backs, the more resolved he became. They could strip away his reputation, his standing, even his name from a map. But they could not change the truth. The land was his, and he would not stop fighting for it. It was late in the afternoon when a beat-up work van turned into Harlan's drive. The sight of it made him tense, at first expecting another contractor or HOA messenger. But when the door opened, it was Rick Dalton, a plumber who lived a few streets over. Rick stepped out with a grease-stained rag in his hand, looking uneasy. He wasn't the type to stop by without reason. "You holding up Harlan?" he asked, his voice low. Harlan studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I've had better weeks." Rick shook his head, disgust clear on his face. "I saw the sheriff's car out here, and then that email Linda blasted out. She's got everyone thinking you sold the land, that you walked away, and now you're just causing trouble." Harlan's jaw tightened. She stood there and said that, at the last HOA meeting, Rick confirmed. Right there in front of everybody. Said you signed some deal with a developer and skipped town. Told folks this hotel was always part of the plan. The words hit like a blow, but at the same time they explained everything. The stares, the whispers, the cold shoulders. Linda hadn't just written lies on paper. She had spoken them out loud, dressed them in authority, and people had believed her. "I never sold a thing," Harlan said. Rick nodded. I figured as much. Didn't sound like you. Some of us never bought her story. But she talks confident, waves her papers around, and folks follow. They're scared to push back. For the first time in days, Harlan felt a flicker of something other than anger. Rick's words weren't a solution, but they were proof he wasn't completely alone. Someone else saw through Linda's mask. You're the first one to say it out loud, Harlan admitted. Rick leaned against the van. Well, somebody's got to. This ain't right. Everyone's afraid of her fines and rules, but that don't make her honest. If you need someone to back you up, I'm in. I don't have much pull, but I won't stand by and watch her steamroll you. The offer was simple, but it mattered. One man standing on his porch choosing truth over convenience. Harlan gave a small nod. Thank you. Rick shrugged, almost embarrassed. Don't thank me. Just don't give up. You've got more people rooting for you than you think. They're just quiet about it. As the van pulled away, Harlan stood straighter than he had in days. The isolation hadn't lifted, but the weight was no longer crushing. For the first time since coming home, he felt the faint crack of light breaking through the dark. He wasn't fighting entirely alone. That night, unable to sleep, Harlan found himself in the old shed at the back of the property. It was the only building the construction crews hadn't touched. Dust coated the shelves and boxes of forgotten tools leaned against the walls. He hadn't been inside for years. In the corner, under a heavy tarp, sat a metal deed box. The sight of it sent a pulse through him. He pulled it out and set it on the workbench, his hands trembling as he worked the stiff latch. Inside were the old family papers, deeds, maps, surveys, yellowed with age. And beneath those a leather-bound portfolio his wife had insisted on creating after her health scare years ago. He remembered her words, "We should make sure this land is safe no matter what happens." Harlan opened the portfolio. His breath caught. It wasn't just a deed. It was the legal documentation for the Jensen Family Land Trust. Every acre of the property had been transferred into it, signed, notarized, and sealed. The trust, not Harlan as an individual, was the owner of the land. For all their paperwork and claims, the HOA had made one fatal mistake. They had filed everything against him personally against Harlan Jensen. But legally, Harlan no longer owned the land. The trust did. The hotel, the foundation, every inch of concrete and lumber was being built on property they had no right to touch. Harlan flipped through the pages, slowly confirming each signature, each date. The documents were airtight. His wife had insisted on protecting the land, and in doing so she had left him the weapon he needed now. A slow calm spread through him. For weeks he had been treated like a trespasser erased from maps, mocked by neighbors, dismissed by the sheriff. But here in his hands was the truth they had all ignored. The land was his untouchable, unassailable because it wasn't tied to him alone. It was bound by law and family legacy. The foundation of the hotel was built on a lie, and that lie was about to collapse. He closed the box and rested his hand on it for a moment, feeling the weight not just of paper, but of justice waiting to be served. They thought they had won. They thought he was finished. They had no idea what he held now. What do you think he'll do next? The clubhouse was full that evening. Folding chairs lined the walls, neighbors crowded together, and a laptop streamed the entire event live on the HOA's community page. Linda had made sure of it. She wanted everyone to see her final victory. She stood at the front table, flanked by 2 board members and her hired security guard. Her voice carried with confidence as she addressed the room. As you all know, the Preserve Lodge will bring value and beauty to our community. We have worked tirelessly to revitalize this abandoned property for the benefit of all. Unfortunately, a former owner has tried to derail our efforts. But rest assured, we have every document, every permit, every approval in order. She held up a stack of papers for emphasis. These baseless claims will not stop progress. Murmurs of agreement moved through the room. Some nodded, relieved to hear the authority in her tone. Others looked uncertain, but none dared to challenge her. At the back, the door opened. Heads turned as Harlan walked in, steady and silent. He didn't raise his voice, didn't rush. He simply moved down the aisle until he stood in front of the table. Linda's smile faltered. "This is a private meeting," she snapped. "You don't belong here." Harlan ignored her and laid 2 documents on the table. The first was stamped red, suspended. The city had frozen the building permit. The second bore the seal of the county court confirming his authority as trustee of the Jensen Family Land Trust. He spoke clearly, his words plain enough for every person and every camera to hear. This land was never abandoned. It belongs to the Jensen Family Land Trust. I am its trustee. Your permits are invalid, your claims are false, and this construction stops now. The room went still. Whispers broke out, confusion spreading like a wave. Neighbors craned their necks to see the papers. Linda's face flushed red. "These are lies," she shouted. "Fraudulent documents. None of this changes anything. The HOA owns that land, and this man is trespassing." Harlan looked at her, calm as stone. "Is that what you told your board?" "That's what you told the bank, too." Linda froze. Harlan let the silence linger before delivering the blow. "Because the loan for your little project didn't come from thin air. It came from a lending firm, and I now hold the controlling stake in that firm, the mortgage on your hotel. It belongs to me." A collective gasp filled the room. For the first time, Linda's confidence cracked. He continued, voice steady. "You've built on land you don't own. You've borrowed money from a lender you don't control. You thought I was a weak old man. But the truth is, you've been standing on my ground building with my money." The board members stared at each other, pale and silent. The neighbors murmured louder, some in disbelief, others already turning against her. The live stream camera caught every detail. Linda reached for her papers, waving them desperately. "He's lying. Don't listen to him. This is nothing but a stunt." But no one was looking at her anymore. All eyes were on Harlan, the man they had dismissed now standing in the center of the room, holding every card. The shift was undeniable. Authority no longer rested at Linda's table. It had moved quietly and completely to the man she had tried to erase. The meeting should have ended it. Any reasonable person would have stepped back, admitted defeat, and faced the consequences. But Linda was not reasonable. In the days after the construction site went quiet. No trucks, no workers, only the skeleton of the half-built hotel looming over the lake. Yet Linda did not disappear. She grew quieter, more frantic, like a storm building behind closed doors. Then one night Harlan woke to the sound of metal scraping. He moved to the window and looked toward the shed at the back of his property. In the pale light he saw a figure forcing open the side door with a crowbar. It was Linda. She slipped inside, a flashlight beam dancing across the walls. Minutes later she emerged with 2 cardboard boxes in her arms. She staggered under the weight, but she carried them across the yard and vanished into the darkness. Harlan didn't move. He didn't call out. Instead, he remembered something Rick had told him. There was a motion-activated camera mounted on a tree behind the shed, one of Rick's setups for photographing wildlife. The thought struck him like lightning. The next morning, Rick arrived with his laptop. Together, they pulled the memory card from the camera and loaded the footage. There she was, grainy but clear. Linda Marks, president of the HOA, prying open his door, rifling through his shed, carrying off stolen boxes. The timestamp glowed in the corner. It was all the evidence they needed. Harlan forwarded the files to the sheriff's department. The same deputy who once served him a trespassing notice returned that afternoon, but his tone was different now. He watched the video twice, his expression hardening. "We'll handle it," he said quietly. That evening, the neighborhood gathered its usual rhythm, children playing, people arriving home from work. Then the cruisers arrived. 2 sheriff's cars rolled slowly down Linda's pristine street and stopped in front of her house. Neighbors drifted onto porches, sensing something was about to happen. The deputies walked to her front door and knocked. Voices rose inside, sharp and angry. A moment later, Linda appeared, her face tight with disbelief. She argued, hands flying, but the deputies did not waver. They turned her around, snapped cold metal cuffs onto her wrists, and led her down the perfect flagstone path. Gasps echoed across the street. Phones came up. Whispers spread like fire. The woman who had ruled with fines, threats, and rules was now being placed in the back of a police car, powerless and exposed. Harlan watched from his porch. He didn't cheer, didn't shout. He only stood still, steady as the balance shifted for good. For years, Linda had built her empire on fear and manipulation. But fear collapsed when exposed to truth. And now, in front of the people she once controlled, her power crumbled into nothing. The arrest was more than justice. It was the moment her kingdom ended. The arrest shattered the illusion. For years, Linda had ruled with polished smiles and threats typed neatly on HOA letterhead. But once the handcuffs closed, her power vanished. The board members tried to hold on. They sent out rushed emails claiming temporary misunderstandings and baseless accusations. But no one was listening anymore. The community had seen the video. They had seen Linda pry open a neighbor's shed like a thief in the night. No carefully worded memo could erase that. The vice president resigned the next morning, his statement short and panicked. Within days, 2 more board members disconnected their phones and stopped answering emails. The once smug group of enforcers dissolved into silence. Anger filled the vacuum. For years, residents had whispered about unfair fines, sudden rule changes, and Linda's heavy hand. Now, with her empire crumbling, the whispers became shouts. Petitions circulated. Signatures piled up. Within a week, the community had gathered enough names to call for an emergency vote to dissolve the current board entirely. At the meeting, the turnout was overwhelming. People stood in the back, crowded in doorways, their frustration spilling over. One by one, they spoke stories of harassment, intimidation, and money wasted. Every word painted a picture of a board that had long forgotten its purpose. When the vote was finally counted, the decision was decisive: the old board was gone. For the first time in years, the HOA was no longer in the grip of fear. Relief spread through the room, followed by something rarer: hope. Neighbors who had once looked away from Harlan now approached him quietly, some offering apologies, others simply nodding in acknowledgement of the truth. As for Linda, her fall was far from over. The theft charge was only the beginning. With the land trust evidence, the fraudulent filings, and the corruption tied to her cousin at the county office, the case against her grew heavier by the day. When she finally stood in court, the confidence was gone. No smile, no carefully chosen words, no clipboard in hand. Only a woman stripped of her authority, answering for every lie she had spun. The same neighbors who once feared her now read about her hearings in the local paper. Some watched from the back of the courtroom, silent witnesses to her undoing. For Harlan, it wasn't triumph he felt most, but closure. The empire that had stolen his land and desecrated his wife's resting place had collapsed under the weight of its own deceit. Greed had built their house of cards. Truth had brought it down. If you've ever seen a greedy person brought low by their own lies, share this story. The half-built hotel stood silent for weeks, a monument to greed and failure. But Harlan refused to let it remain that way. He gathered the neighbors not for a fight this time, but for a plan. The building would not be torn down. It would be repurposed. The ground floor would become a community workshop and gathering space. The upper floors would be transformed into temporary housing for veterans and their families. A place of healing, not division. At first, there was hesitation. The wounds left by the HOA were deep, and trust was fragile. But when the work began, something shifted. People arrived with hammers, paintbrushes, and coffee. Veterans from nearby towns came to lend their skills: electricians, carpenters, plumbers. Dale, the old surveyor, returned to oversee repairs, grumbling but smiling as he measured beams. The sound of construction was different now. No more bulldozers, no more angry shouting. Instead, there was laughter echoing down unfinished hallways. Children ran between stacks of lumber. Neighbors who once avoided each other now worked side by side, hanging drywall, painting walls, planting flowers by the entrance. Harlan moved among them, quietly guiding when needed, but letting the community take ownership. For him, this was more than a project. It was a promise kept to his wife, to his family's land, to the people who had finally stood with him. Slowly, the building changed. The cold shell of concrete and steel warmed with color and light. What had begun as a monument to Linda's empire became a symbol of resilience. When the last lock clicked into place, the hotel was no longer a hotel. It was theirs, a place born not from greed, but from solidarity. Justice had been served in court, but here on the ground, something greater had taken root. Justice paired with humanity. When the noise of rebuilding faded and the hotel had been reborn, Harlan turned to the one place that mattered most, to the spot where the great pine once stood. He cleared the ground himself, leveling the soil until it was smooth again. Then, with his own hands, he planted a young pine, its branches reaching upward, fragile but full of promise. He pressed the earth firm around its roots and stood back, breathing in the scent of fresh soil. At the base, he placed a bronze plaque. The words were simple: Maggie's View, always home. The message was not for the neighbors or the community. It was for her, for the wife who had dreamed of watching the sunrise from that hill, for the promise he had made to protect the land. The vow was whole again. Harlan stood in silence, the lake glittering below the wind, carrying the sound of laughter from the lodge behind him. The land had been scarred, but it was healing. The community was healing. And so was he. Sometimes the people dismissed as weak, overlooked, or silenced are the very ones who hold every piece of the game. Linda had never seen it until it was too late. Harlan brushed the dirt from his hands and looked up at the sky. The pine swayed lightly in the breeze, already part of the place it was meant to belong. If you've ever witnessed injustice, leave a comment, me too. And don't forget to follow for more stories of Undercover Boss.